Welcome to session 8 of the RISE conference. And I think everyone knows that being the last session of a conference is not exactly like headlining a rock concert, but fortunately, this session is about teachers. And, it's plausible that someone at an education conference might say, I just don't care that much about politics, or I'm just not that interested in COVID. But if someone were to say, I just don't care that much about teachers, well, let's say I think we could have interesting conversations about your vision of education. But anyway, more importantly, we're really lucky for this panel that we really have 4 very excellent papers, and I'm excited about all of them. For the structure of this panel, as before, each presenter will have 15 minutes, and then we'll round out the 90-minute panel with Q&A. And again, it'll be a mix of Zoom Q&A, preferably using the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and in-person questions from the 3 hubs. And before all of that, I'm just going to offer a little bit of framing. And the headline for this panel, at least from my possibly biased perspective, is that things are both more complicated and more encouraging than we might think. And I'm going to highlight both complicated and encouraging things from each paper, starting from the 4th paper in the panel and working in reverse order. So the 4th presentation, it looks at how teachers are allocated and distributed across the education system and between schools. And for that, we'll have Sandeep Datta and Geeta Kingdon telling us about whether or not there's actually a teacher shortage in India. Now, the complicated part of this is that there are so many different factors and perspectives involved. So there's existing government data and public perceptions that there is a serious teacher shortage, but really the administrative data might be kind of off if you look at it with the wrong lens. And also there are sort of teacher allocation rules that might have become increasingly inappropriate over time. And also there are assumptions about class size that need to be interrogated. So that's a lot of complications. But the encouraging part is that when you look at all of this rigorously, it turns out that there's actually a much smaller teacher deficit, or possibly even a surplus. So yay, and you could save a lot of money, even more yay. So next, zooming in a little bit, looking at interactions at the classroom and school level, we will have Sabrine Big talking to us about a school management training intervention in Ghana that was designed to complement a teacher training intervention. The complicated part here, one of the many, is sort of in the background of the paper. We know that often teacher training interventions, when they stand alone, don't have very large effects or long-lasting effects. And we know this is also true of standalone management interventions, like we saw yesterday from Yakuba Silia in the school governance presentation in Tanzania. But the encouraging part is that, as Sabrine will show us, when you combine teacher training and management interventions and closely integrate them, there's real potential for gain. So coherence can be good, to use RISE speak. So zooming in even further, our 2nd presentation will be comparisons between classrooms. And for this one, Sonia Kritikova will be talking to us about teacher effectiveness in Vietnam. Complicated bit here being that measures of teacher value added can vary a lot between countries, and we don't actually know that much about teacher value added in developing countries, or actually really about TVA anywhere beyond English-speaking developed countries. We also don't know that much about teacher value added for areas of student development other than the strictly academic. But the encouraging part is that Sonia's paper is part of a growing body of work that really shows us how we can improve our measurement and analysis, especially of a wider range of student outcomes and in a wider range of countries. And that can really help us improve our understanding of this, which in turn can help, I think, with addressing trade-offs and priorities. And most zoomed in, we're looking at what happens in the classroom and in teachers' heads. And for this, we have Vassal Nurani, who's going to talk to us about a teacher training intervention in Uganda. The complicated part here is that there are a whole lot of different types of teacher knowledge that matter for student learning. So teachers need support not only in really specific aspects of teaching that are tightly linked to content, but also in broader aspects of pedagogy and metacognition. To use education speak, it's really not just about very specific content knowledge and very specific pedagogical content knowledge, but also about more general pedagogical knowledge and more general pedagogical content knowledge. And the encouraging part is that when you do such training, as Vassal will show us, it can really help to cultivate children's development. And personally, I'm also very encouraged that he's showing us that an emancipatory pedagogy can lead to real improvements in standardized test scores. So on that note, Vassal, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much, Yue-Yi, and Thank you for the organizers. I've learned so much throughout this conference. I'm currently my host institution at the University of Chicago. I'm visiting Makerere University, partly to follow the wisdom shared by Devyani in the previous session, to think about how to build coalitions in Uganda for the teacher training that I'll be presenting on today. This is joint work with Abhijit Banerjee and Nava Ashraf. So I think, let's see, I am not seeing this. Okay. Okay, great. So the slides have moved. So throughout the conference, we've heard mention of the learning crisis. I think here, what I'm going to highlight is one of the barriers to improve student learning is access to high quality teaching. And many have noted that pedagogy in much of the world is based in rote learning of facts. And this is one of the things that's really holding back student learning. So naturally, we would look to teacher trainings as avenues that can improve teacher pedagogy. But unfortunately, evidence of programs aimed at improving the general teacher skills show null or even sometimes negative effects. So instead, what we've seen throughout this conference is our approaches that train teachers or even complement or replace teachers with technology along a structured pedagogy row, which helps teachers or the classroom to execute a recipe of pedagogical tasks that have shown to improve specific and targeted learning outcomes. So while these approaches are certainly useful in advancing basic learning and some other forms of learning, they may not be as effective as students advance in their education, where more complex forms of human capital need to be developed, such as critical thinking, scientific inquiry, soft skills, and so on. So given the importance of teacher quality in affecting later life outcomes, we still need to look for evidence of effective programs that target the whole teacher. So this is what I'm going to present to you today, is an intervention. Sorry, there seems to be a lag with the slides. Maybe somebody over there can take control of the slides. Okay. So I'm going to ask a simple question in this paper. And the question is, does a novel approach to teacher training improve teaching quality? And we're going to try to get some general answers from this as well. And the coarse answer to this question is yes. By learning to learn, teachers can in fact develop high competencies in learning how to teach. We do this by studying the work of a partner organization in Uganda that trains in-service teachers to be producers of knowledge. In other words, not just to consume information or knowledge, but to learn how to pose sharp questions, use precise language to describe the world around them, really to be and act like scientists. And we're going to look at the results of a randomized control trial 2 years after this intervention was introduced. After these 2 years, only 40% of the teachers in treated schools have been trained. So you should take that into account when seeing the dramatic results. Next slide, please. So very simple design. We have 14 matched pairs of schools. We randomly assign one within this pair into the training. The intervention has taken place over 2 years. Each year has had one cohort of 40 teachers. We're going to look at data that was collected in November 2019. Of course, some of you may be wondering about statistical power. We were originally thinking about having this study powered with 90 schools, and we added 57 schools in January 2020. Of course, I'm presenting the results today because, in fact, we were well powered and even overpowered even for 29 schools in this study. But stay tuned as we collect data, once the COVID situation is resolved in Uganda. Maybe the next slide. So I want to present the highlight of our results here. So really, there's dramatic changes between control and treatment schools after 2 years, which really stakes a claim for general skills in service training. So first, there's a 24 percentage point increase in the pass rate of this very high stakes primary leaving exam, which determines whether or not students in primary school can attend secondary school. So that's already quite large. 51% in the control schools is consistent with the national average of the pass rate. But there's also, so in terms of standard deviations, the intent to treat effect that we're looking at here at the school level is 0.61 standard deviations, which is also very large. There's also, what I'd like to highlight is a qualitative difference in the distributions of outcomes. You can see in the treated schools, all distributions are shifted across the entire distribution of student ability, and there's bunching of performance in the lower end in the control schools, which is really consistent with this narrative in which teachers spend more time focused on students with higher ability in the control schools, whereas in the treated schools, we see teachers implementing a pedagogy that is targeting students across the entire spectrum. Next slide. So I'm going to focus most of the presentation discussing the intervention. There are so many results, I didn't know really how to target them, but if time permits, I'll get through as many as possible. But what I wanted to share is that this intervention is actually one that's been in development since the mid-1970s by Fundaec, an organization in Colombia. Their curriculum called Preparation for Social Action was originally designed as a tutorial program in rural secondary education that applied scientific capabilities in rural youth to the investigation of community processes. This scaled across all of Colombia, really from the 1980s to the 2000s, and then internationally from 2000 on. And in Uganda, it was originally implemented in 2007. But our organization, partner organization, Kimanya Ngeo, reinvented the use of these materials in some way towards the implementation of a teacher training program. And I'm going to unpack that in a little bit. But basically what's happening over the course of the year, there are 3 intensive periods of study accompanied by visits by the tutors. The study periods happen during the holidays and the visits happen during the terms. Next slide. So there are 2 major elements of this training that I would like you to fix thoughts on. First, the training recognizes that in order for teachers to change their own pedagogy, they benefit greatly from experiencing the rich ways in which alternative pedagogies can transform their own understanding of how to learn. So with this in mind, I want to share one of very many examples of this type of learning environment that the teachers experience in the training. So the very first encounter with the curriculum is one in which teachers are asked to make shapes out of clay. And after making the shapes, they're asked to describe what they've made. And so while a teacher might simply define a cuboid object to be a cube, the tutor in this teacher training begins by challenging the teacher, noticing dents or imperfections in the handmade object that make it something other than a perfect cube. And then the tutor will ask the teacher to try to describe the object more precisely. So this seems like a simple exercise, but it challenges the teacher's notion that the tutor has to be the source of all the answers. It really forces them to try to describe with great precision what this shape is, which also helps them to understand the concept of shape in general terms. And then they also begin to recognize that the descriptions of the world in general that they make are not exact, but can reach higher degrees of precision as one's ability to describe advances. And this is just one of many examples of the types of scientific capabilities, such as using precise language to describe the world around us, that the curriculum introduces. Others are ability to analyze assumptions, articulate hypotheses, collect and interrogate evidence, and so on. All of this in a very practical, hands-on way that marries theory with practice. Next slide. So after experiencing these alternative modalities of learning, the second major element to fix your thoughts on is the metacognitive analysis of the training experience itself. So focusing on the cube exercise, the teachers might study some more materials to appreciate how the curriculum and the pedagogy embedded in PSA was internally coherent and was designed specifically to enhance the conceptual understanding of the teacher to develop precise language in the student. So along these lines, the tutor might ask, so how did the pedagogy that the teachers were introduced to in this class affect the teacher's thinking? And the teachers will begin to recognize that the focus on questioning, on student-centered approaches helped the teacher develop their own power of expression as a learner and also a deeper understanding of shape. But they also begin to recognize that the teacher needs to embody certain characteristics. So for example, the teacher cannot assume an answer. The teacher has to have an orientation of humility. The teacher has to be open to data, refinement of ideas, and so on. And again, I can't emphasize enough that this is because they themselves have experienced this learning environment and are now analyzing their own experience of that environment. And so using the language, thanks. Using language from the last session, now we can think about how this training helps to develop instructional coherence. So next slide. So really, to think about the predictions that stem from this intervention, we have to think the counterfactual as the baseline pedagogy of banking, the banking model where the teacher really thinks of their students as depositories and themselves as the ones making deposits of information into the students. Relative to this counterfactual, we should observe pedagogy in which students become more engaged, ask more questions, and so on. And this should also lead to learning improvements along multiple dimensions, improvements in standardized tests, scientific competencies, critical thinking across the board. And eventually we'll also look at community level spillovers, but that's not the focus of this paper. Next slide. Actually, can you also go to the next? So this is a balance table with some school characteristics. I'm going to skip it for sake of time. Also, you've already seen the results on the primary leaving exams. So thank you for moving to this one. So there are 3 out of the 4 primary leaving exam results are very large and statistically significant. But as we learned from Julius in the previous session, again, these are not coherent with the expectations of the competencies that students gain. So look at, for example, a science test. So that primary 6 students receive. Question 1 says, can you give one reason why people keep poultry? And the answers that are acceptable are that they are sources of eggs, meat, or for sale. Can you go to the next slide? So that clearly doesn't tell us whether or not the student is competent in scientific thinking. But what we did was we analyzed the NCDC's, the Curriculum Development Center's expected competencies of science students in P6 and developed a science show together with the District Education Office that would allow us to measure these competencies almost one-to-one. And we designed a rubric that was classified competencies along 5 categories. Students' ability to frame a problem, design a clear experiment, articulate and test hypotheses, measure outcomes, and articulate their thoughts independently. There's an example of one such question below, but let me go to the next slide. So as you can see, when it comes to the student's ability to design an experiment, to articulate their hypotheses, link them to the experiment, to observe and measure outcomes systematically, to communicate their thoughts independently, the last measure what was particularly interesting because we replicated a seminar environment in which students were challenged to give with an alternative explanation of the results that they saw. And we saw that the students in the treated schools were much more capable at responding to that challenge and articulating their thoughts independently. Next slide. So what's also interesting is that we can kind of link this to teacher inquisitiveness. We have a measure of whether or not a teacher conducts more research when they're posed with a question that they don't know the answer to. And we see a positive correlation between teacher inquisitiveness along these lines and the science show outcomes, but only in the treated schools, which suggests that in the control schools, the teachers might say they're inquisitive, but they don't know how to leverage that inquisitiveness towards improvements in scientific competencies. Next slide. We also introduce alternative measures of student learning using a RISE paper from 2017 that classifies assessment questions under ability to apply their understanding, to think critically, and also a separate creativity exercise, also a psychometric exercise from other literature, all showing that students are thinking more critically in the treated schools and are able to think of more creative uses of local resources in their communities. Maybe we can let's skip to the last slide. So these other slides show that there are also changes in teacher pedagogy and teacher effort. And there's many more results in the paper, but maybe I'll just conclude by saying that what we presented is a new class of teacher trainings that provides teachers with general skills and with striking results on pedagogy and student learning. This is different from structured pedagogy and can potentially complement structured pedagogy. So it's not like it's a, either or type of question. But what I want to emphasize is that a key ingredient of this intervention seems to be that we really need to spend the time necessary to immerse teachers along these two lines. One, to really enable them to learn as learners along these modalities that are being emphasized across the board, like student-centered learning and active pedagogy and so on. But then also, because of that experience gives rise to the ability to engage in metacognitive analysis of the pedagogy itself. And those two ingredients combined are quite useful. And as I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk, we're now working with various partner organizations, both in Uganda and outside, to think about the core principles and the core model that can be extended to primary teacher colleges and other organizations as the program goes to scale. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Vassal. I'm not sure where the camera is, but Sonia, you're up next. Over to teacher effectiveness in Vietnam.
Great, thank you.
It might take a moment for the slides to come up, but you're welcome to start. Oh,
there they are. And I can take control of the slides, I think. Right, okay. So thank you. It's great to be here. This is joint work with Pedro Carneiro, Paul Blavatnik, and Anusha Guha. And we're looking at value-added estimates of class and teacher quality for primary schools in Vietnam here. So as already motivated in the introduction, we have evidence for high-income countries, in particular the US, to suggest that access to high-quality schools and teachers can have long-lasting positive effects on life outcomes. But we have much less evidence, a much smaller body of work for low and middle income countries, which is slowly growing, but remains quite small, as well as quite a limited focus on the role of schools in raising academic skills in particular. And so that's kind of a broad motivation for why we are looking at these questions in the context of Vietnam. In addition to that, Vietnam is particularly interesting, and I'm sure the RISE people have heard this motivation before. This is Vietnam stands out as a very high performing country in terms of their PISA scores for their income level, for example. And at the same time, they are currently undergoing important school reforms that are focusing on some potentially quite significant changes to curriculum and teaching methods. So you kind of have this high performing system in some sense, which is really thinking about implementing some big changes. So it seems like an important context in which to sort of take stock, as well as think about how these reforms might impact student development. Just a little bit more on the context. Almost all of the primary schools in Vietnam are state managed, so we are really looking at public schools here. There is a very centralized control. So that comes from the Ministry of Education and Training in Hanoi. I just looked at DWMS, so World Management Survey data that we just collected in our schools and has been benchmarked against other countries. And these schools come out as particularly strong and stronger than usual for the level of overall management on target setting and monitoring. And that's sort of consistent with this very centralized approach. The recent focus has been on encouraging students to develop skills for the modern economy, as they're called. So that is going beyond just strictly academic skills and focusing on social skills, creativity, self-learning ability, as well as changing teachers' methods. Now, in terms of what's actually been implemented, that's been fairly limited, but there have been big announcements and a lot of discussion around this 2018 announcement of fundamental and comprehensive reform of education. So this is sort of a kind of snapshot of the context in which we the study set. Now, this is a plot you've probably seen presented within the Vietnam work many times, but I kind of couldn't really not include it. This is just showing what an outlier Vietnam is in terms of the PISA scores. So this is plotting PISA scores in maths in 2012 against log GDP per capita, showing that on the whole, as we know, scores increase with country income, but Vietnam, which is on the left-hand side corner, really has very high average scores for its income level comparable to much, much richer countries. So really it's this very interesting outlier. So the RISE primary school study, so we've designed this panel study of primary schools in Vietnam to shed more light on the role that parents, teachers, and schools currently play in shaping different skills. So sort of really focusing on the system that's currently in place, pre really any reforms taking place. A few core features of the study. We have an approximately nationally representative sample of 140 primary schools. We have a 2-class-2 cohort design. So we are following 2 neighboring cohorts of children, and we measure children in 2 classes per cohort in every school. And that allows us to do some of the analysis that I'm going to be presenting today. We're not just measuring the school dimension, we're also measuring home inputs and interviewing parents, so we're able to look at a more complete picture of what's happening with children's learning. I'll talk a little bit about measurement as I get to the exact measures we have, but we do place a lot of emphasis on better measurement of hard to measure constructs, and also on a broader conceptualization of child skills. So we're not just looking at academic skills, we're looking at a broader set of competencies, and that's very much in line with the kind of policy focus in Vietnam at the moment. So in this particular paper, what we're doing is studying the role that class and teacher quality play in explaining variation in skills and competencies of these primary school kids. And we look at academic skills, but also at competencies that have been identified as high priority skills in the Vietnam new curriculum. So we look at executive functioning, which relates to self-managed learning and problem solving, as well as children's self-esteem, self-perception about their own competence. And finally, we're able to assess whether essentially teachers who are good at teaching maths are also the ones who are good at boosting other competencies. So we're able to assess whether the same classes are relatively effective at developing all of these skills, or whether the classes which are effective at maths are different from the ones that are effective at other competencies, which is relevant for thinking about how to implement this curriculum reform. So our design, so as I mentioned, we have 2 cohorts in primary school, and we follow them between grades 2 and 4. The first cohort, we surveyed at the beginning of grade 2 and end of grade 2, then end of grade 3 and end of grade 4, so we can measure learning in every school year. And the first round of data was collected in November 2017, and the last one in April 2020. Then there was the next cohort. So those guys were in grade 2, November 2018, and we just collected the last round of data for them in grade 4 in 2021. Now, in this paper, we focus just on grades 2 and 3, leaving aside grade 4 for now. And the measures that we have here, we have beginning for grade 2, we have beginning and end of year maths and Vietnamese, as well as much more data that we collect just at the end of the year, measures of non-cognitive skills, student interviews, teacher interviews, parent interviews, and we do videos of teaching, which are currently being coded. So we don't use them in this analysis yet. Then in grade 3, because we have end of grade 2 measures, we don't collect beginning of grade 3, we just collect end of grade 3 measures of all the same things, other than parent data. Parent interviews we only collect in grade 2 and grade 4. So that's a kind of a quick snapshot of the design and the data we collect. So what do we have? Focusing first on the bottom of the table, we have in each cohort, we test over 5,000 students. So we try to test 20 kids per class in maths and Vietnamese. And this is across 140 schools and 280 almost classes in each cohort. We were not able to do the non-cognitive assessment on as many kids because that was one-to-one, much more time-consuming process. And so here we assess 7 children per class. So we have about just under 1,700 children per cohort with measures of non-cognitive skills. So across the two cohorts, you can see, and I should have sort of tested these differences. I apologize that I haven't, but on the whole, these two cohorts, as one would expect, look quite similar. These are kids in neighboring cohorts who go to the same schools. So we don't see any particularly large differences that we might worry about. In terms of the analysis that we do, so what we want to be looking at are class and teacher effects. So in getting these, the first step is regressing the child score at the end of the year on the classroom indicator and on a lagged score from the beginning of the year or the previous year. And that gives us these classroom indicators, which we then use to get our class effect measure. What we do with these is we demean them. So actually we're relying on variation within schools. So we subtract the mean class effect from these class effects that we estimate the mean within the school in order to deal with concerns about selection into schools. So non-random selection of children into schools. So that's at that level we deal with selection. We still potentially have a problem of selection of students across classes within schools. And we can maybe touch on that in the discussion. According to teacher reports, that's not an issue, but we're still doing a little bit of analysis to see whether we can show that in the data.
Sonia, 5 minutes.
Thank you. And finally, we're interested in the variance of the class effect, and we use a shrinking procedure in order to deal with concerns about sampling error. So that gives us the class effect. So we have this variance within school, variance in class effect that we can look at. In order to get at the teacher effect, though, we want to kind of rid it of the classroom shocks. And there we use our two cohort design, and we can look at the covariance in class effects across cohorts in cases where we have the same teacher teaching grade 2 in two cohorts. And that the square root of that covariance gives us standard deviation of the teacher effect, assuming that our classroom shocks are not correlated over time. And so we're able to then separate out the teacher effect from this overall class effect. I'm going to, for the sake of time, maybe just tell you we're looking at maths and Vietnamese assessments of executive functioning and of student self-perception about their academic and social skills and physical appearance, as well as we use a scale of independence of mastery versus dependence on teacher. So the Vietnamese assessments are curriculum linked, and they were constructed for us by the Vietnam Institute of Education Sciences. We piloted them extensively. We used IRT in order to kind of assess the psychometric properties, removed badly performing items, etc. And so in the end, we use the IRT scores that are standardized within grade. So moving to the results then, we get class effects. So in this table, we show class effects for maths and Vietnamese in the first 4 columns for grades 2 and 3, and then teacher effects for grades 2. I mean, the big takeaway here is that the class effects look similar in size to class effects estimated in other contexts, for example, in Ecuador or in the US. While the teacher effects are actually a fair bit smaller than the other estimates that we have. So our teacher effect suggests that the 1 standard deviation improvement in teacher quality will raise scores in maths and Vietnamese by about 5% of the standard deviation. That's about half of the smallest teacher effect that has been found in other studies. Moving on to the estimates for non-cognitive skills. Here, we're not able to separate out teacher effects because of our design. And so we're really looking at class effects here, but these systematically seem to be larger than the class effects that we find for maths and Vietnamese. So for executive functioning, they're in the range of between 0.17, 0.12 and 0.17 of a standard deviation, and between 0.13 and 0.16 for the self-perception measures and mastery measures. The point I wanted to get to is this cross-correlation table, and this is still kind of something that we're investigating. So this is a sort of initial step analysis, but really looking at the correlation of these class effects, cross-correlation. So basically asking, is there a positive correlation between class effects for maths and Vietnamese, and class effects for non-cognitive skills, so self-perception and mastery, and as well as executive functioning, which is sort of in the cognitive domain. And if we look at the last two rows of this table, so for the maths and Vietnamese, we see significant positive correlations between class effects for those and for executive functioning measures, and significant negative correlations occur for many of our non-cognitive measures, suggesting that the classes where children are doing better in maths and Vietnamese are not the ones which are more effective in raising non-cognitive skills.
So you have 45 seconds.
Perfect. I will just conclude just picking out this seems an interesting finding. The fact that the teacher effects are quite small. So suggesting that teacher quality may play a smaller role in driving inequalities in attainment than in other contexts. And that's interesting in the context of Vietnam being a high performing system. So it suggests that Vietnam may be able to manage to achieve not only a high standard of teaching, but also a higher level of uniformity across primary schools than other contexts. And this lack of correlation between classroom environments that foster development in different domains, that seems an important finding for considering what happens when the curriculum moves towards emphasizing this wider set of competencies and what trade-offs teachers and children are going to face. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sonia. Next, we're going to go to Sabrine in the DC hub. And while she gets set up, I want to encourage everyone, because it is Friday afternoon in the UK, and this is the teacher session. So I'm going to be very teachery and say, everyone stand up and stretch. I'm going to shamelessly do it. And wow, Oxford Hub people are following. I feel like I'm back in the classroom. But yes, on that note, having been re-energized, hopefully, Sabrine, it's all yours.
Clearly, you have your priority state, or not. So I'm going to present joint work with Adrian Lucas, who's at the University of Delaware, and Anne Fitzpatrick, who's at UMass Boston. They told me it's going to take 10 seconds, but you're going to be angry at the next slide. It's the learning crisis, partly because of the trashy curricula that countries have. But if you compare how much students know relative to curriculum, they are behind. But even if you put the curricula in the trash, students are not learning foundational skills. And what we want to bring your attention to is not that we don't have the interventions to move learning. The problem is not what the interventions are. There are examples of successful interventions that can improve learning in schools and provide higher levels of achievement. However, there is a constraint in terms of implementing those interventions. Sorry, I didn't take my mask off. Implementing those interventions in existing systems. So the constraint is not what we can do, but how to do it. And given the likely complementarity between teachers in the education sector and managers, there is a further constraint in delivering successful programs into the classrooms when those two actors are not aligned. So for managers in particular, there is considerable evidence from the private sector that managerial skills and quality matter for output. In the public sector, there is some correlational evidence from the healthcare, education, and civil service sector. There's mixed evidence on causal effects of improving management. And so what we're going to ask in this specific project is if managers are engaging managers from the civil service can improve public sector service delivery and program implementation when some of the programs that we have seen in this conference seem to suffer from implementation constraints. Can we improve program implementation by engaging civil service managers. And so there's kind of two challenges. One is an empirical challenge, like management is not randomly assigned, so we're going to tackle that with a randomized controlled trial. Another is a more practical challenge because you have to work within existing systems. We face constraints that are part of any systems, which include weak incentives, very fixed hierarchies. It's hard to it's hard to follow a McKinsey style management change where you can just fire unproductive people. And so we're working with a fixed set here, and we're going to try to overcome those challenges. So given the goal, that our goal is to see what the importance of managers is in improving public sector service delivery, we're going to partner with the public sector, the Ghana Ministry of Education, and we're going to implement an existing pedagogical program, which is going to be differentiated instruction. I'll explain that in a little bit. This program in particular has had a lot of success when implemented with additional support in classrooms, which includes both assistant teaching support or supervisory support, but not so much success when implemented with existing teachers and supervisors. And I'll try to go through what the constraints are. So we will implement this existing program, and we'll engage managers in two different ways: through a 3-armed randomized controlled trial, where in the first arm, you'll provide the teacher training, and we'll engage managers. So as Yue-Yi was mentioning, align the manager with the program by inviting managers to the teacher training and giving them a classroom observation checklist, which is focused on the program, not on sort of broadly what's happening in the classroom, but really what the teachers were given in the training. Our second intervention is going to include everything in the first intervention and combine it with a management training for managers. This specific management training was focused on the people management skills of managers. I'm going to go into more detail, but it improves the dialogue between teachers and managers through a 3-day training. In control schools, there will be business as usual, and this is all implemented within existing systems without adding anything to the system. So what is differentiated in the spirit of teaching at the right level or targeted instruction? In our context, it involves splitting students who are in grades 4 through 6 in primary schools in Ghana by learning level for part of the day instead of by the grade level. 4 days of the week. For each of those days, for 1 hour, students sit according to their level instead of according to their grade. Their level is determined by a test and assessment at the beginning of the year. So it requires teachers to coordinate across classrooms. And there is, I'm going to show you a role for supervisory support. And so what do we know from differentiated instruction or teaching at the right level implemented in different contexts? On the left there, as you see it on the screen, are successful implementations of targeted instruction or differentiated instruction. And most of them have come from when the program is implemented by a system. So if you double the number of teachers in the classroom, you are able to target instruction to students very well. When you implement differentiated instruction with existing teachers, there is less take up of the program in particular, which leads to lower test score grades. So on the right, there is 5 different studies that in India as well as Africa that implement differentiated instruction without adding additional support, and the effects are much smaller. The only kind of large effect there is when the assistant teachers were not hired, but additional supervisors were injected into the system. So when there is kind of very targeted supervisory support, we get the gains. And so given this evidence on implementing differentiated instruction in classrooms across various contexts, the importance of management is kind of apparent. And here's why those effects are not very large. So in Ghana in particular, when differentiated instruction was implemented the way I described it with existing teachers without hiring assistants, only 6% of teachers actually do it. So during random spot checks, teachers either are just not there or they're just teaching like they normally would. They don't take the effort to move students around as they had been determined by their, according to their ability. So our interventions are going to first, in our first arm, we call it the basic intervention, the basic management arm. Teachers are going to get trained. Head teachers are going to attend the same training as teachers, and they're going to utilize these classroom observation checklists that are focused on differentiated instruction as delivered to teachers in the training. And again, to align all of the levels to really, for the government to take ownership of the program and to align the different levels in the hierarchy of teaching, if we're engaging in this arm, managers are in a very basic way, and then there is also district and national monitoring teams that visit schools throughout the semester, so every term, once a term. In the second arm, we call it the enhanced management training arm. We just tag on management training. This management training is really, you know, once you become a chair of the department, you maybe get this training, which means you have to be nice to your subordinates. You have to not be critical, but be supportive, and really kind of emphasizing the role of managers as mentors more than monitors. So these are people may describe the bulk of this training, which was designed by the government, focuses on people management soft skills. And this is the added part of, you know, this is what we add in the second treatment arm. So this is what the design looks like. Because we are, you know, the managers that we engage include head teachers, as well as circuit supervisors. We randomize circuits are groups of 10 geographically proximate schools. So we divide all of the circuits in 20 districts of Ghana into either the basic group or the enhanced group. In the basic group, we have schools where there's no teacher training, and schools where the teacher training is added on. In the enhanced group, we have schools, we pick schools identically, but we don't have schools without the teacher training. We have schools where there is teacher training. So we end up with 3 groups of schools, one where there is no teacher training or no head teacher training, one where there is the basic manager training, and another, the third group is where we have the basic classroom observation checklist, but also the enhanced training.
Sonia, just under 5 minutes.
Okay, awesome. So we collect data at the baseline level. We have 2 spot checks over the course of the intervention year, and then we have inline data at the end of 1 year. And then we have some data from while the pandemic happened, but this, I want you to think of this as data 1 year after the intervention, so more like medium-term data. So I'm going to show you results on first the management quality. I skipped over the measurement, how we do it, but I'll try to cover as much as I can as I show you the results. Then I'll show you what happens in the classroom and finally go to student test scores. So we take inspiration from the DWMS, the World Management Survey, to construct 3 management indices, really aligning these indices with what we delivered as part of the intervention. So the very first management index is what we call an instructional management index. This is the focus on classroom observations. This is part of our basic, this is the outcome that we think our basic arm moved. It is what happens in the classroom. It's focused on classroom observations. We have a people management index, and then I have all other management, which is covered in the WMS, but was not really targeted by our program. So you see equal improvements in instructional management, but because that is expected, it was part of both interventions, we see a significantly larger, 0.6 standard deviation high improvement in people management as expected in the enhanced arm. And then we also see spillover to other management, which was not necessarily targeted by the program, but there's once you get managers engaged, they do some other things better as well. But this is like a proof of intervention that we designed to improve instructional management the same way in the 2 arms, and we see that, and we designed the intervention to improve people management significantly more, and we see that. In the classroom, unlike I'm going to show you how DI was done, but we see more active classrooms. It's the last, I guess, column that I want you to focus on. We see improvement in teacher and student engagement as well as TLM use in the class, shown by this active learning index. And we see DI being implemented. And this is happening in 60% of classrooms compared to 6% before. So you see a greater fidelity to the program. However, it's equal in the two intervention arms. So management quality improves differentially, but classroom implementation improves roughly equally across the two arms. We see some differences in teacher burnout and stress in the enhanced arm. So where the managers are given the training, teachers report being more stressed. And student S scores equal, as equal as it can get. So we don't see any different. We see a gain of 0.1 standard deviations relative to control. This is about a third of year relative to control learning, but it is equal across the two arms. So just to sort of, in the last minute, we see also persistent effects both on management, and this is again very encouraging that once you engage managers, you can get teachers to do it, and you can get them to do it for in the medium term as well. So just to interpret the results, how can we contribute to the existing evidence on teacher trainings and on management trainings? On the one hand, there is some work questioning whether managerial skills affect productivity. So the studies that look at causal effects in the education sector don't necessarily find that you can train managers and study improve, suddenly change how students learn. On the other hand, management does seem important. So we can bridge these two together by showing that the basic intervention improved importantly the instructional part of management, what happens in the classroom, and it leads to student learning improving. Enhanced management, while it improved the people management skills, does not necessarily lead to differential increases in student test scores. This bridges the existing evidence where tagging on management, even in a basic way, can improve what you gain just from teacher training alone or just from management training alone. So our results are suggestive of the importance of instructional management, but also of the strong complementarity between teacher training and management training given all of these studies altogether. I think I'm out of time according to all the Yue-Yi you haven't spoken about.
You can have one last
so I'm going to
sentence.
stop there.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Sabrine. And now last but definitely not least, we have, yay, DC Hub Love. We're going over to Sandeep and Geeta, and while they get set up, I'm going to have a drink of water, and I encourage you to do the same.
We're
Whenever
set
you're
up.
ready. Yes.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much. I hope I'm audible. Our paper is called Teacher Shortage in India, Myth or Reality. And this is co-authored with Sandeep Datta. I have clicked on it and I'm hoping, yes, it does move forward. So a very common explanation in India for poor learning outcomes is that class sizes and pupil-teacher ratios are large. And this is because it is said that there is an acute shortage of teachers. The education minister has cited figures in Parliament in response to parliamentary questions in 2018, citing vacancies of 900,000, and in 2020, citing vacancies of just over 1 million teachers. The draft National Education Policy 2019 identifies, high pupil-teacher ratio as one of the factors behind the learning crisis in India. And the actual policy itself, which is promulgated a year later in 2020, says that teacher vacancies will be filled at the earliest. And it also costs, what will be the cost of doing that? And the cost comes to about $14 billion per annum in order to fill these 1 million teacher vacancies. The main question of our paper is this diagnosis correct? Is there truly that much of a dearth of teachers? This is a very common perception. This slide tries to show that figures, statements from the Ministry of Human Resource Development saying India is reeling under a crisis, which is the dearth of school teachers. The top think tank of the country, making statements like that. UNESCO saying 74 countries face an acute teacher shortage. While Nigeria tops the list, India is second. And so on and so forth. Quite a lot of, the director of the NCERT, India's, highest education research body, and so on and so forth. So it's an extremely common perception. Let me just move forward. The research question is obvious. Between 2010-11 and 2017-18, in the 7-year period, the pupil-teacher ratio fell from 31.2, national average pupil-teacher ratio fell from 31.2 rather, to 22.8. There was this dramatic reduction in pupil-teacher ratio of 8.4 pupils per teacher. And this was, when we decompose this into its two components, that part of the reduction in pupil-teacher ratio that was due to a drop in enrollment in public elementary schools, we find that 64% of the reduction in the pupil-teacher ratio was as a result of this really quite alarming abandonment of public schools and move towards private schools. But 36% of this reduction was due to the increase in the number of teachers in the system. So even as pupil enrollment was falling, number of teachers was being increased due to teacher recruitment. So the main table really of our paper is this one. And here we see that the third column, which is headed teacher vacancies, as per the Ministry of Human Resource Development's report for the year 2017-18, if you just look at the last row in each of the tables, which is the 21 major states of India, which is basically 97% of the population of the country lives in these 21 major states. So when we say this, it is pretty much a figure for India as a whole. So we see here that there's about 900,000 teacher vacancies. Now, when people are talking about teacher vacancies, they're not at the same time, just as with the teacher allocation norms of the Right to Education Act, teacher vacancies are determined in relation to those teacher allocation norms of the Act. Just as some schools have deficits of teachers, compared to those norms, they have too few teachers. In the same way, there are other schools that also have excess teachers that are surplus or greater than those that would be required as per the norms of the Act. So we have, to our knowledge, this is the first time anybody's made an estimate of the excess teachers state-wise, and we see that there are 735,000 excess teachers. By our estimation, the number of vacancies, if we apply the Act's teacher allocation norms precisely, it's 762,000. So what we find is that in the net, in fact, the number of teacher vacancies, the number of deficit in teacher numbers is only of the order of about 26,600 teachers, as against the perception of 1 million teacher shortages. Now, I will come back to this slide, but I want to move forward to, because the last three columns depend on showing that, in fact, you see all of these figures that we've cited so far depend on the self-reported, schools' self-reported self-reported enrollment numbers. There is reason to believe that the self-reported numbers are very likely to be inflated or over-reported. We see here the histogram of total enrollment in public elementary schools. And we can see that at certain junctures, there's a big inexplicable jump. And these junctures occur at, for example, at 61. So immediately below 61, schools are underreporting their number of students. I mean, they are not reporting that they have, for example, 53 students, 54, 55, all the way to 59 or 60. As soon as it's 61, there's a large number of schools reporting 61, 62, 63, and so on. Similarly, we see jumps at 90 because new teachers, more teachers are allocatable as per the norms of the RTE Act at these junctures. Any school that has up to 60 pupils enrolled in it is going to be given, as per the norms, 2 teachers. From 61 to total enrollment of 90, a school will get 3 teachers. From 91 to 120 pupils enrolled, the school will get 4 teachers, and so on. But primary schools on 100 teachers, 100 on an enrollment of 100, they also get a head teacher. So we see that at 100 as well, this massive peak. And if I move to the next slide, we see the same histogram, but for one state of India, which is the state of Uttar Pradesh. And here we see this massive jump at an enrollment of 101. And we see that at 150, 100, at 200, and so on and so forth. So what this is showing is that there is a, and this is not surprising, because in fact, there are incentives for schools to over-report enrollments. For one thing, teacher allocation itself depends on reported enrollment, but also other incentives from the government that are given to children. For example, the grains to schools for midday meal, the cooking of the midday meal for distribution to the children. Sweaters, school bags, school shoes, uniforms are all distributed based on the reported number of students. And these are self-reported numbers from the DICE data. So it is expected that there would be increases. Now, we don't have a great deal of evidence about the extent to which enrollment numbers are inflated. However, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India and the Midday Meal Authority have made some estimates based on which we have, come up with our own estimates. We've had to make certain assumptions about the rest of the these states, but for the states for which they have given estimates, we have included those here. I don't have time to go through that, but the details are in the paper. But going back now, armed with this information that there is a substantial degree of fake enrollments and exaggerated enrollments, we can now go back to the last 3 columns of this main table of ours. If we adjust for ghost enrollments, if we remove these fake enrollments, estimated fake enrollments, the number of teacher vacancies falls to 518,000. The number of teacher surpluses or excess teachers rises to 860,000. And now there is, in fact, if anything, a net surplus of 342,000 teachers, roughly. Now, what are some of the fiscal implications of this? We consider that briefly as well. And current pupil-teacher ratio is 22.8. If these 882,000, nearly 900,000 teachers were recruited as the National Education Policy promises, then the pupil-teacher ratio will fall further to 15.9 pupils per teacher, which is probably quite low comparing it with most of the developing countries. If we were to cost, if the additional fiscal cost due to pupil-teacher ratio being maintained at less than the allowable 30, it comes to $7.5 billion US dollars per annum. The cost due to additional planned recruitment is another $6.5 billion dollars, and the total of these two, total spending, excess spending, if you like, due to surplus teachers compared to the allowable, maximum of 30 pupils per teacher, is $14 billion per annum. And we've done some benchmarking. Yeah.
We got 5 minutes left.
Okay. So to what extent is this shortage of teachers due to the teacher allocation rule? As we saw in the 7 years or as I will show you, in fact, I will go to the slide that shows this. This slide shows us what the implications have been of the abandonment of the public education system over the period of time under consideration. I'm not showing the change, but I'm showing the situation as it pertains to the year 2017-18. So this is all public elementary schools. There's just over 1 million public elementary schools in the country. And I've divided them into schools that are 20, that have a total enrollment of 20 or fewer. And we see that there's 127,000 nearly, 127,000 schools that have a total enrollment of 20 or fewer children. And in these schools, they constitute, first of all, 12.3% of all government elementary schools. And in these schools, the pupil-teacher ratio is, the total enrollment on an average in each of these schools is 12.6 students per school. and the pupil-teacher ratio is 6.4 pupils per teacher. 60 or fewer children enrolled in the school. Nearly half of all the schools have 60 or fewer children enrolled. We are talking about only public elementary schools. And these nearly 500,000 public elementary schools have a mean pupil number of pupils per school of about 31.6 pupils per school, and a pupil-teacher ratio of 13 pupils per teacher. And if we take the bigger category, those schools that have 100 or fewer children enrolled in them, there are 700,000 such schools, and these are cumulative. This is a cumulative total. This category includes the previous two. So there are 700,000 such schools. They constitute about 2/3 of all schools, and mean pupils per school in these 700,000 public schools is 45 children. Now, this is self-reported, which is expected to be inflated. And if we believe it, it's 15.8 is the pupil-teacher ratio. Now, there are different ways of cutting the data to showcase how the minifying of schools has happened and what the implications are for pupil-teacher ratio. Obviously, for the hilly states of Himachal, Jammu, and Uttarakhand, it is understandable if a high proportion of schools, public schools in these states have a pupil-teacher ratio below 10 pupils per teacher. But even in the plains states like Kerala, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, Assam, Punjab, more than a quarter of schools have a pupil-teacher ratio of below 10. Below 20, nationally, about 46% of all schools have a pupil-teacher ratio below 20. I think that I will come to the conclusions. I could show quite a lot more data. What we have done in the rest of the paper, which I will not show you, is that we have made various adjustments. We've said this hypothetically, if the allocation rule for teachers to schools were changed, one modification were made, that for schools that have only up to 20 pupils, one teacher will be allocated, because in any case, the average number of pupils in such schools is 12.6 children in the school as a whole on an average. So if that were the rule that were made, what would be the implications for the number of teachers and for the fiscal costs? We've also done state level analysis to see whether it is possible to have redeployment of teachers from teacher surplus schools to teacher deficit schools. We've also done some district level analysis to see the scope for inter-district or within district redeployment of teachers. So just to conclude, basically we find that in order to reduce wastage, it's important to have data on actual enrollment, and it is possible to do that through linking it with the Aadhaar cards, which are the ID cards. So I think more progress needs to be made on that, because that seems like a really important way of saving money, scarce public resources, which can be used hopefully for better uses. A review is needed of the teacher allocation rules of the RTE Act, which mandates 2 teachers for even very tiny schools. And indeed, a review is needed of the maximum pupil-teacher ratio of 30 that is mandated by the Act, because in fact, in the literature, there is no such known threshold as such. And the research on pupil-teacher ratio or class size and its impact on pupil learning, which is also done by Sandeep and myself in a companion paper, doesn't really show that. And that's very consistent with other papers by Banerjee and Duflo and others who have done work on the impact of class size on learning in India. Secondly, I think
can you wrap up in one final sentence, please?
Sure. So basically, I think that much more analysis is needed by the states on how much of the teacher shortage problem can be solved by net new hiring and how much through redeployment. And finally, I think that the state needs to consider, of course, it's politically challenging to transfer teachers, and yet the state needs to consider how fair it is for citizen, the taxpayer, to pay for the hedonic rent that many teachers are enjoying by going to schools very near their homes and teaching very few pupils. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Geeta. Great. Now, we're going to go to Q&A. I'm going to start by reading out 2 online questions before we go to the hub. So hubs, please get people and mics ready. And also, as another note, as I read out these 2 first online questions, this is again another great time to stand up and take a stretch break. Okay, so the first question is from Dana for Sonia. And she says, I'm curious to hear more on the fact that classrooms which improve Vietnamese and math were not the same that improve non-cognitive skills. Do you have a hypothesis as to why? wouldn't we expect the two to move together based on evidence suggesting that non-cognitive skills improve academic skills? So that's for Sonia. And I'm going to also read out a question from Abhijit for Sandeep and Geeta. And how much of the, Sandeep, feel free to come on and answer the question as well if you like. I know you're on the line. So how much of this decline in enrollment and in pupil-teacher ratio in public schooling is due to the move from public to private? And how much is due to declining cohort sizes because of fertility changes? He says that his impression from ASER for rural areas is that private enrollment share has been pretty stable since 2010. So over to Sonia on cognitive and non-cognitive skills.
Thank you. Yes, I think that's an interesting finding. I think I can speculate. I mean, we're currently coding the video information that we have, so the films of the classes, which we have for all of the classes in the study for all of the years. And so I'm hoping that we will get some insights into different teaching strategies, what's driving this some differences of what teachers are doing between these different classes, which are more effective at raising cognitive versus non-cognitive skills. I mean, in terms of speculatively, the kind of methods that are used in Vietnam in order to get the high attainment that we see on the PISA scores, etc., the high attainment in academic skills, are methods that, at least in the perception of the Ministry of Education there, are not yielding the kind of development of a broader set of skills. So those methods, so in a sense, it's not a surprise necessarily that teachers who are really good at using those methods in order to get the high attainment are not the ones who are also good at building these non-cognitive skills. Now, in terms of sort of the skill development process, how these skills feed into each other and what are the dynamics of, when you increase, how do non-cognitive skills then later or at the same time translate into cognitive skills is an interesting question. But we know those dynamics from, say, early childhood interventions and how the long run effects of those dynamics are quite complicated. And so there may be something about, it may be that these children with higher non-cognitive skills now early on will translate into better attainment further down the line. But that's not necessarily what we see now. What we see now is that the non-cognitive skills earlier are quite predictive non-cognitive skills later on. So they're correlated over time. They're valid measures, but they're really not correlated with the cognitive skills at the moment in our sample.
Thanks. Just to jump in super quickly, because it's hard for me to resist being nerdy about teachers. There's a paper on US data from the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching program by Blazer and Kraft, where they also find that the teachers who are better at raising test scores are not necessarily the same teachers who are better at boosting non-cognitive stuff. I think there's something like child self-efficacy and happiness, so not the same social-emotional measures, but there's stuff there. Also, we have a paper forthcoming from our Pakistan CRT by Tahir Andrabi and Christina Brown that looks at how when you use different measures for teacher performance pay, then you get different classroom dynamics and different levels of student satisfaction, but for comparable levels of student learning gains. Anyway, sorry for that tangent. Now over to Sandeep and Geeta about declines in enrollment due to shifts from public to private or from fertility rates.
Yeah, it's a good question, Abhijit. Thanks for it. Basically, I've got data from DICE, which District Information System on Education, which I know you're familiar with. And basically it shows, and I was just looking at it up as, having heard the question before. And the answer is, I've got it right in front of me, that between 2010 and 2019-20, between 2010 and 2017-18, the number of children enrolled in public elementary schools fell by 2.4 crore, 24.8 million. And the number of children that increased in the private unaided schools, it increased by 21 point something million. So it is the case that it is not the case that total fertility rate reduction accounts for much of it. It could be that that also plays a part in states where there has been, this total fertility rate has been falling quite rapidly, like Kerala, etc. But this does not seem to be the whole story. The major part of the story seems to be a shift, it seems. at least if we believe DICE data, and we know that there are some problems with DICE data, but that's what it's showing.
Thank you very much, Geeta. Now we're going to do a round of questions. We'll do Oxford Hub, then Abuja Hub, then DC Hub. From the Oxford Hub, I think, Miguel, you had a question for Vasal?
That's okay.
That's all right, just ask it. Not everyone reads the Q&A.
Yeah. So my question was just about the control group in the RCT. So I wanted to ask, I asked whether it was an active control, and if not, to what extent we could actually make the claim that the improved outcomes could be attributed to the training design and not just the fact that they were trained. Yeah, but Vessel gave a very good answer on the chat anyway. So thank you.
That's right. Vasal, if you could just repeat what you wrote, because I, and I'd imagine other people here at 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon are not great at multitasking, so.
Well, I was also very pleased to hear Miguel found it convincing. But yeah, so no, we don't have an active control. It's kind of, we don't have the resources to add another branch to the study. Hopefully in the future, I think this first study is kind of a proof of concept of a fairly new, innovative idea. And so now that there's evidence, we can, think about how do we allow normal science to kind of continue to pick apart of this question. But that said, I do think that our results are more consistent with the theory that there's capacity developed in the teachers relative to an alternative where it's just, let's say, motivation from sitting in a teacher training that's affecting change. One of them I presented in the presentation, but went through it very quickly. It's about an effect on teacher inquisitiveness. That's there's a direct treatment effect on teacher inquisitiveness, but we see a correlation between teacher inquisitiveness and scientific competencies only in the treated schools, and a negative correlation in the control schools, which suggests that teachers are able to actually leverage this quality of being inquisitive after the training, but not outside of the training, which suggests there's some qualitative difference in their ability to exercise inquisitiveness in the classroom. There's other results such as we have a null effect after the first year because there's probably not enough time for pedagogy to change in a way that would respond to that would be reflected in student learning. But then after the second year, the result blows up. And there's some more, but really I think I'm excited about this being as the beginning of an agenda where we unpack a lot of these questions. Thanks, though.
Yeah, I am excited too, vicariously. Right, over to Abuja Hub. Do we have any questions over there? We can't hear you yet.
We have, I have a particular interest in the last presentation. The challenges in the meat of the teacher scarcity. It drew my attention to what is happening in Nigeria, and I wanted to find out if they considered the teachers in undocumented private schools, teachers in different categories of private schools. In a state like Lagos, we discovered that we have a very large number of private schools, more than a public school. And some of these private schools may not be in the government radar and the government statistics. Now, even those who are in the government statistics, in urban areas, we discover that parents may like to take their children to private schools. And some of the private schools may have very large teachers because the parents are able to pay high. So in a classroom, you may have about 10 students, because the parents are paying higher, the school owners are able to pay the teachers and sustain the teachers. So you see a large number of teachers, maybe something like 1 to 10, teacher ratio maybe something like 10:1. But in the government statistics, we keep seeing large numbers for those government may be able to collect the data from to know that the teacher number is very low. So I think there is a lot of data, a lot of gap in the data or in the statistics, giving us the large number of teacher vacancies and gaps we are seeing. I think there's something may be wrong somewhere, not just in the teacher numbers or teacher pupil ratio. There are also other areas, similar issues are happening. So I think there's need for us to—
Can you wrap up your question, please? Sorry, can you just, can you wrap up in one sentence, please?
Okay, so I am saying there is need to consider the private schools and the nature of the private schools themselves. I'm not sure if, I don't know if they consider this.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question, the context,
Did you want me to answer it? Try to answer it? Yeah, just very quickly. So basically, actually, the situation seems to be entirely the opposite, exactly the opposite in Nigeria compared to that which the data shows for India. In that, the reason why the pupil-teacher ratio seems to be high, very much higher in the private schools, is probably because of this shift from from the public schools to the private schools, because of perhaps a perception that the private schools are providing better quality education. Whatever the perception may be, whether it's right or wrong is not something one can really say, not on the basis of our research anyway. But that is the reality of it, that the pupil-teacher ratios typically are significantly higher in the private sector than in the public school sector. And that's largely, I think, because of the exodus from the public schooling sector.
Great, thank you so much, Geeta. Over to DC Hub, do we have a question there? Can't see you on the screen. There we go.
I had a broad kind of RISE question, and maybe specifically for the speakers. I mean, there are two very different kinds of presentations here. One is, how do we change the system? That's what Geeta is talking about. At some level, Sonia's presentation is going to lead eventually to, recruiting teachers or retaining them or something of that sort. And then the other two presentations are about very specific products in the production function, right? And it almost, so the question that I had was, eventually, how are we going to merge the two? Is the idea going to be that we are going, or governments should look at RCTs and select the one that's the best? And how are they going to do that? Are they going to select multiple? Or is it that schools should be able to select? And if so, Wessel, for example, your presentation on learning to, Polya's book, George Polya's book, the Art of Problem Solving, which has been a classic for the last 80 years, is precisely this. Right? I mean, it was aimed to teachers to help them. It's exactly, I mean, the shape problem you gave, that's Polya, page 85 to 100 exactly, right? So it's been around for 100 years. There's been very little take up outside Russian math, right? Now, was that because there was no RCT of it? Or was it, how are we going to approach this? I mean, given that there's so many products becoming available, should we allow schools to choose between Sabrine's management intervention and your learning or TARL? Should we impose it on the schools? If we impose it on the schools, are we worried that somebody politically more powerful than us will impose something else, which is what usually happens? I mean, just some sense of, how are we going to merge these two very different takes on the education system?
Thanks, Jishnu. I think I'd like to start with Sabrine for that question, because her paper was about an intervention that did try to
hardest
marry
question.
two strands of things. But yes. Then sorry, Sabrine, after Sabrine, any other presenter who wants to jump in, just jump in. But yeah, all you.
Great. So that is completely right, that for most of the research that has been done has been trying to figure out the most effective components of the education production function and sort of implementing those in very controlled environments to see what are the most effective or the most cost-effective ways. And very little until recently has been dedicated, very little attention has been dedicated to figuring out how to take these recipes and then embed them into systems to sort of spur a more systemic change. And so I think just from our experience in Ghana, one particular thing that has come out from this study and other studies that I have been a part of is the political will of governments. Once governments are, once there is buy-in from the big actors, you can take some of these recipes and successfully implement them and make them part of systems. So political will would be, I guess, would be necessary to bring on that systemic change. The question about whether schools should be able to pick or government should be able to pick, there is some work on trying to train policymakers on how to read studies or how to pick effective studies or what to dedicate resources to based on the research there, and some of them seem to work. So maybe that's part of inducing governments and policymakers to make the right decisions, not just what they feel would work, to really pay attention to what really works. I think another important thing is the studies that have been until recently done don't really pay attention to cost effectiveness, and the recent focus on that should also make decision-making for policymakers easier. And they should, pick the most effective, and also external validity, the most effective and cost-effective interventions for their context is maybe where we should start, and then add in the political will, as well as, managerial capacity to really sort of be ready to implement systemic change. Not the answer directly to your question, just some thoughts.
Still a very insightful set of thoughts. For the others on the panel, I'm going to give you the option of having each having 30 seconds, either to take another stab at Jishnu's very sweeping question or just any last words you have. Faisal, why don't you go first, because you presented, yeah.
I was excited that Jishnu asked this question. It's something we're thinking about. It's the kind of thing we'd probably talk about over dinner if we were all in person. But I think this concept of internal coherence that was described in the previous session has a lot to do with it, I think, because you also see within the government sector and even the civil sector that there's different conceptions of the purpose of education. And when there's different conceptions of the purpose of education, then there's also incoherence along the lines of which one do we select. So actually, we are thinking a little bit about how do we affect change in terms of the internal coherence of how people think about what they want to achieve and then what instruments are available for achieving that. And one way that we're thinking about doing this is designing a 3 to 4 day learning to learn seminar for lower level administrative staff in the Ministry of Education and other places, which I think will kind of create the opportunity for people to start thinking and asking, are our systems internally coherent, and what do we need to do to advance towards that?
Great.
We'll see what happens.
That was a longish 30 seconds, but a great use of it. Sonia, any quick thoughts from you? Really quick.
Yes, not super original, and maybe I'm not sure this gets to Jishnu's point, but I guess I think about the big picture and the small picture, and I think and that the trick is really to move research closer and closer to middle ground. So if I think about the work we're doing, this is extremely unoriginal and difficult to do, but develop the tools and the methods that we need to unpack a little bit about what it is that distinguishes good teachers from bad teachers, etc. And then we have a menu of interventions that can be matched to specific problems we identify, but covering that middle ground of really moving from that top level to identifying the problems in a more granular sense, which requires measurement innovation. And for example, is probably where I would see the hope for the two connecting.
Thanks, Sonia. Geeta, do you want to give us one sentence?
I'll duck the really difficult question because I think it's a very legitimate question as well. One is apt to get bamboozled, whether as a country or even as a school, with the number of RCTs, the number of different interventions that are whose impact is being tested. So it is very difficult for them to know how to do it. Of course, one could go by the effect size of the different things, but then that requires that they should be sort of omniscient, all-knowing. They should know about all the possible ranges of research that's being done. I'd just like to make one statement. There was a comment in the comment box by, I think, Louis Crouch, about how, the kind of diagram, the histogram that I had shown, that it may be a good idea to do that for other countries. I just wanted to make the point that, often, when Sandeep and I have tried to present this paper to people in India, particularly to politicians, they say that, look, our MLAs, our members of the Legislative Assembly, they like to appoint more teachers because that's the way in which they dispense largesse, and that's the way in which they win votes. So there's a whole political economy behind the numbers for why, all the time there is this statement about 1 million teachers shortage. So I think that it could be more generally applicable, this what we found for India. So I think it's well worth trying it for some other countries as well.
Great, thank you, Geeta. I'm not going to attempt to summarize in great detail all of these wonderful thoughts, but I think just to say, I think these papers and the discussion flag lots of deep questions about the purpose of education systems, and sort of the decision rules that result from that purpose, and how we get all the different actors and parts of the system aligned with practices that suit that purpose. And I will just conclude with the strapline that I started with, that things are both a lot more complicated and a lot more encouraging than we might think. And on that note, over to the DC Hub for a final note from Lant Pritchard, the RISE Research Director.
So my very limited role as the RISE director for this conference is to enjoy it. And I have very much enjoyed the last 3 days of hearing just paper after paper after paper of really interesting, provocative, thought-provoking results and thought-provoking questions. And so I am now not going to attempt in any way, shape, or form to summarize or synthesize or anything else. I'm merely going to thank the people that made all of this possible, for all of us to be here in the 3 hubs, and for the hundreds or so that have joined us online. It took a long time of planning and then of implementation. So I'd like to start by thanking the conference organizer, Claire Lever. Claire Lever has organized the RISE conference. I think this is the 5th year. And every year it's been just super excellent and gets better and better. And even in the difficult circumstances in which we can't all get together, I think we've hopefully provided a pretty seamless experience where people kind of enjoyed it in person or online. So first, let's thank Claire. Where's Claire? Then I'd like to thank the people who were the chairs of the sessions, Jason, Yue-Yi, Tina, who was here yesterday to do the Trash This, Kirsty Newman, Marla. I'd like to thank all of the people who were the chairs of the individual sessions that tried to provide some coherence and especially enforced the unbelievably important norm for an academic conference of time deadlines. It's hard to do, but it's absolutely essential because otherwise it gets run away. So let's thank the people who were the committee members and chairs of the sessions. There was a conference committee that kind of shepherded this along, that included both RISE members and RISE fellows, Luis Crouch, Michelle Kaffenberger, Renata Lemos, Felipe Osario, myself, Peter, and Marla. And those were the ones who went through the whole kind of from brainstorming to choosing papers to doing everything, supporting under the strong and capable leadership of Claire. So thanks to the committee organizers. I'd like to thank the AV teams who are standing in the background. And we had a AV team in Abuja. In DC, we have the Optimum AV team and their team leads Ralph and Kyle. In Oxford, we had Fred, Jamie, Sam, and Fraser helping us. So I'd like to thank the AV teams for keeping us all online, connected, seeing all these screens and getting everybody who needs to be heard. Thank you. Then I'd like to thank the Abuja. It was wonderful to have the hub in Abuja. We know we attempted to create a kind of hybrid system where we had some people together in person, and we know how hard it was in the COVID era to create an online, an in-person presence in any country. So we really thank Chuka, the executive director, Obena and Ellie in Nigeria for creating and making possible the Abuja Hub. Thanks to the Abuja Hub. And then our DC Hub would like to thank Whitney and Shardul. And for Whitney and Shardul, we have flowers. Where are they? And I do think, and then last and not least, in fact, maybe most important, would like to thank the team in Oxford with support from the OPM team of Tom, Camille, and Ed, but especially would like to thank the RISE kind of external team of Joe, Lily, and Katie. And I'm sure we have something for them in Oxford. We have something for them in Oxford, right? We're seeing, I don't know why the Oxford AV team is wandering around with the camera. Where are you? Anyway, so we'd like to thank, there we are, have Claire giving them flowers. And so you see the dozens and dozens of people around the world have supported this. I think coming together to talk about how one addresses the learning crisis in the world is really one of the most important things we can have spent our time on. It is, in fact, I think one of the world's pressing problems that will affect the future of humankind. And it's now squarely on the agenda in a way that it maybe wasn't even a decade ago. We are making fitful progress. I don't think we're far from having come to, and shouldn't be coming prematurely to sort of overarching conclusions, but the engagement of serious thought, serious attempts to measure concepts, serious attempts to measure causes and effects, I think is pushing the frontiers forward. And I thank you all for being part of that larger endeavor. And with that, I'd like to close the conference. Thank you very much.